A masked man stands on a front porch in the middle of the night. He is gloved. He is armed. He carries a 25-liter backpack and a handgun holster on his hip, and he already knows exactly where the camera is. He does not hesitate. He does not look around. He goes straight for it. The FBI does not retrace its steps without a reason. When the most powerful law enforcement agency in the United States starts pulling on a thread that leads all the way back to a warm Tuesday afternoon in October 2025, they are not tidying up loose ends. They are following something real. Something that, until now, most people watching this case have not fully seen. Today is day 50 in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. She is 84 years old. She depends on daily cardiac medication to stay alive. There has been zero confirmed proof of life, not once, not a single day across this entire investigation. The reward for information stands at over $1 million, and as of right now, not one arrest has been made. This is the Nancy Guthrie case. And we are just getting started. Before we go any deeper, if you are new here, welcome to Notebook V. We do not do surface level. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because this story is not over, and neither are we. Now, who is Nancy Guthrie? Nancy Guthrie is not a famous woman. She never sought the spotlight. She is the kind of woman who talks about the air in Tucson, the quality of life, the javelinas that wander into her garden and eat her plants. She is the kind of woman who raises a glass with her daughters on a Tuesday afternoon and laughs freely. She is a mother, a grandmother, a woman of faith who had dinner with her family on a Saturday night and expected to be in church the next morning. She has lived in the Catalina foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona for decades. She built her life there, her home, her routines, her favorite restaurants, a life so full and so present that her daughter flew home from New York to put it on television for the world to see. That daughter is Savannah Guthrie. If you watch NBC, you know that name. Savannah is one of the most recognized faces in American morning television, an anchor of the Today Show. And it is that connection, that specific and very public connection, that investigators now believe may have made Nancy a target. On the evening of January 31st, 2026, family members dropped Nancy off at her home in the Catalina foothills. Her garage door closed. She was inside. She was safe. That is the last confirmed moment anyone saw Nancy Guthrie alive. What happened next unfolded in the dark, in the hours after midnight, in a home where an 84-year-old woman had gone to sleep expecting to wake up to another ordinary day in the city she loved. She never called for help. She never ran. She could not, because by the time anyone knew something was wrong, she was already gone. 50 days. No proof of life. No arrest. No answers. But here is what has changed. Here is why this video exists right now. The FBI is not just searching for what happened on February 1st. They are asking a far more disturbing question. When did this actually begin? And the answer they appear to be chasing leads all the way back to a single afternoon in October 2025, inside the dining room of a restaurant that has stood in Tucson for 100 years. That restaurant is El Charo Cafe, and what happened there on October 17th may be the moment this nightmare was set into motion. Stay with me. Here is what the evidence tells us. Not theory, not speculation. Confirmed fact, on the record, stated publicly by law enforcement. Nancy Guthrie's blood was found at the entrance of her home. DNA tested, verified as hers. Her purse was left behind, her keys were left behind, her phone was left behind. Her medication, the cardiac medication she depends on every single day to stay alive, was left behind. Everything that connects a person to the outside world, Everything she would have reached for first if she had any choice at all was still sitting inside that house when investigators arrived. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos did not hedge. He did not soften it. He stated publicly and without ambiguity, she did not leave voluntarily. The evidence at the scene indicated she was taken against her will. Now, here is where the timeline becomes important. At approximately 1:47 in the morning, a figure reported consistently across multiple outlets. Her doorbell camera was disconnected. Not malfunctioned, not lost power, disconnected. At approximately 2:28 in the morning, her pacemaker stopped syncing with her phone. That device, the one keeping her heart beating on schedule, went dark. And in the silence that followed, no alarm was raised, no neighbor heard anything, no call was made. She was simply gone. On February 10th, the FBI released doorbell camera footage to the public. What that footage shows is not a panicked opportunist. It is not someone acting on impulse in the dark. The man on that porch is masked. He is gloved. He is carrying a 25-liter Ozark Trail backpack. He wears a ski mask and a handgun holster. And he had already tampered with the camera before the footage captured him. He knew exactly where it was mounted. He had planned for it. That man has never been publicly identified. Then came the ransom notes. Multiple notes, confirmed by law enforcement, sent not to the family, but to newsrooms. Think about that for a moment. In a standard kidnapping for ransom, you contact the people who love the victim. You create pressure, you create urgency, you work the emotional leverage directly. But whoever took Nancy Guthrie sent those notes to journalists. 2 deadlines passed. No escalation, no third note, no proof of life, no response of any kind. FBI special agent in charge addressed the communication pattern publicly, describing it as unusual for a case of this nature, not standard, not what investigators expect to see. The contact pattern itself became a data point, and that data point points towards someone operating with a specific and deliberate intent that does not follow the standard script of a ransom kidnapping. This is not behaving like a normal case, and 50 days in, the investigators working it know something the public does not yet fully understand. The person who did this had been watching long before February 1st. The preparation required to know where that camera was, to know her routine, to know the layout of her home, to time an entry in the middle of the night without alerting a single neighbor, that does not happen in a week. It does not happen in 2 weeks. It takes time. It takes observation. It takes a starting point. And that starting point, the moment investigators now believe this may have begun, traces all the way back to a dining room in Tucson on a warm afternoon in October, back to a television camera, a national audience, and a woman laughing with her daughters over prickly pear margaritas at El Charo Cafe.
October 17th, 2025, Tucson, Arizona. A Tuesday afternoon, warm enough to sit outside, bright enough to film without extra lighting, ordinary enough that no one in that dining room had any reason to feel watched. Savannah Guthrie had come home. NBC had sent her back to Tucson for a segment the network called Homecoming Today, a feature about the city that raised her, the places she loves, the life she carries with her even from 1,000 miles away in New York. The production team spent hours filming across multiple locations: Saguaro National Park, the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum, the University of Arizona campus, and then, at the end of the day, the place Savannah says she comes to every single time she returns home: El Charo Cafe. You need to understand what El Charo is before you can understand why this matters. This is not a trendy restaurant. This is not a place that opened last year with a good Instagram presence. El Charo was founded in 1922 by Monica Flynn, a woman who is credited by many as the person who invented the chimichanga. It is the oldest continuously family-operated Mexican restaurant in the United States, a Tucson institution over a century old, the kind of place that carries the memory of the city inside its walls. Tourists seek it out, food writers write about it, television crews love it. And on October 17, 2025, a national television crew set up cameras inside it and began filming a segment that would be watched by millions. At a table inside El Charo that afternoon, Savannah sat down with two members of her family, her sister Annie and her mother, Nancy Guthrie. For several minutes, on camera, before an audience that would eventually reach millions of households across the United States, Nancy Guthrie was present and visible and warm and completely herself. She talked about why she stayed in Tucson after decades of moving around. She talked about the air, the quality of life, the way the city moves at a pace that feels human. She laughed about the javelinas eating her garden plants. She raised a prickly pear margarita with her daughters. She smiled the way a person smiles when they are genuinely happy and completely unaware that anything is wrong. She was introduced to the American public as Savannah Guthrie's elderly mother living in Tucson at her favorite restaurant. The segment aired nationally on NBC on November 5, 2025. It also ran on the Today Show's YouTube channel. It was clipped and covered by local Tucson media outlets before it even aired nationally. This was not a quiet moment that slipped past unnoticed. This was national morning television, millions of viewers, a famous anchor, a warm human story about family and hometown pride, exactly the kind of content that travels. And here is the question the FBI has been sitting with ever since. Who else was watching? Not the millions of ordinary viewers who tuned in, smiled, and moved on with their morning. Not the local Tucson locals who recognized their city and felt proud. Someone else. Someone who watched that segment and did not see a heartwarming story about a daughter coming home. Someone who saw something entirely different. An elderly woman, alone, in a specific city, at a specific restaurant, connected to a name famous enough to carry the assumption of significant wealth. News Nation correspondent Brian Enton was reporting from Arizona on March 11th that investigators had gone back to locations where the Today Show filmed that fall segment, specifically back to El Charo. Enton reported that FBI agents visited the restaurant and asked staff behavioral questions. Not routine questions, not witness identification questions, behavioral questions. The kind of questions that tell you investigators are building a profile of someone who may have been present that day with a purpose nobody else knew about. Now, here is where honesty matters, and this channel will always give you honesty over a clean narrative. The Arizona Daily Star, a Tucson-based newspaper with reporters physically on the ground in this city, reached Ray Flores, president of Flores Concepts, the parent company that operates El Charo. His response was unambiguous. "We would have talked to the FBI," he said. "They never called us." Two accounts, one from a credible investigative correspondent with a strong track record on this case since the beginning, one from the restaurant's own management. Those two accounts cannot both be entirely true, and this video is not going to paper over that conflict the way a lot of coverage has. What we can say with full confidence is this: those behavioral questions, whether posed in person, through intermediaries, or through other investigative channels, reflect a real and coherent investigative theory, a theory the evidence does not contradict, a theory pointing directly at one specific afternoon, one specific dining room, and one specific person who may have been sitting inside it for entirely the wrong reasons. The FBI is pulling on a thread, and that thread begins here, at El Charo on October 17, 2025, on an afternoon that felt like nothing but warmth and family and the particular happiness of coming home. Let us be precise about what this theory is and what it is not. It is not confirmed. Law enforcement has not stood at a podium and said, "Someone watched the Today Show and chose Nancy Guthrie as a target." No investigator has stated that on the record. What we have is a direction the investigation is moving, a set of behavioral questions pointing at a specific afternoon, and a timeline that, when you lay it out in full, does not contradict the theory at any point. That is not nothing. In a case with no named suspect and no public arrest after 50 days, a coherent and evidence-consistent theory is exactly the kind of thread that matters. So here is the theory, and here is why it holds. Someone watched that November broadcast, or the YouTube clip, or the local Tucson coverage that ran before it even aired nationally. At some point, in some version of that segment, they saw an elderly woman sitting inside a famous restaurant in a specific American city, laughing with her daughters, talking about how much she loved her life there. They heard her name, they saw her face, they connected her clearly and publicly to one of the most recognizable anchors on American morning television, and they made a calculation. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, living alone in Tucson, Arizona, connected to a household name, a woman who, by every visible indicator, had a family with resources, a woman who, based on what the segment showed, had roots in that city deep enough that she had no plans to leave, a woman who went to the same restaurants, who had routines, who could be found. That calculation, if it happened, did not lead to an immediate act. It led to a plan, and plans take time. By January 11, 2026 at the latest, confirmed by neighbor accounts and by the FBI's own footage requests from cameras in the area, someone was already in her neighborhood, not passing through, present, the kind of presence that, in retrospect, neighbors described as something that felt slightly off without being explainable in the moment, a vehicle that appeared more than once, a face that did not belong to anyone on the street but did not do anything obviously wrong. That is what surveillance looks like before anyone knows it is happening. There may have been a second visit around January 24th. That detail has been reported and is consistent with the behavioral pattern investigators are tracing, though it has not been confirmed officially. What has been confirmed is this: the man who appeared at Nancy Guthrie's front door on February 1st was not improvising. He was not testing his luck. He was prepared in a way that required prior knowledge of the specific layout of her property, the location of her camera, the timing of her household, and the absence of anyone else. You do not arrive masked, gloved, armed, and already knowing where the camera is unless you have been there before. Not physically, perhaps, but in your planning, in your research, in your watching. This is what the FBI means when they describe the investigative lens turning backward through time. They are not looking for new evidence of what happened on February 1st. They are looking for the moment someone decided it was going to happen at all. And right now, the earliest confirmed point of exposure, the moment Nancy Guthrie became visible to a national audience as a specific, identifiable, locatable person in a specific American city, was November 5th, 2025, the day that segment aired on NBC, with filming at El Charo 3 weeks before that. Here is something that deserves to be said plainly, because the emotional weight of it is real and it should not be avoided. Savannah Guthrie brought her mother on television because she loves her, because Tucson is home, and home means family, and she wanted the world to see that. Annie was there because that is what families do when a camera shows up and the moment is warm and real. Nancy raised that glass and laughed and talked about the javelinas because she was happy, completely and genuinely happy, sitting in her favorite restaurant with her daughters on a Tuesday afternoon. None of that is a crime. None of that is a mistake in any moral sense. Loving your city out loud is not a crime. Appearing on your daughter's television program is not a crime. Being proud of your family is not a crime. But it may have been seen by exactly the one person who should never have seen it.
That is the weight investigators are carrying right now as they pull this thread. That is the question underneath every behavioral interview, every canvas of the neighborhood, every frame of surveillance footage they are still reviewing. At what moment, in what living room, or on what screen, did an ordinary act of love become the starting point of something unforgivable? And somewhere in the answer to that question is the person who took her.
50 days is a long time. In a missing persons case involving an 84-year-old woman dependent on daily cardiac medication, 50 days is not just a number. It is a weight. Every person working this case feels it. Every member of Nancy's family feels it. And anyone who has been following this story honestly, without the comfort of false hope, feels it too. But here is what the people calling this investigation dead are getting wrong. This case is not cold. It is not stalled. It is not the kind of investigation where agents check in once a week and hope something turns up. What is happening right now, behind the press conferences and the public silence, is an active and expanding investigative effort that is quietly reaching into corners this case has not touched before. Start with the forensic work. Mixed DNA was recovered from the scene. Mixed DNA means more than one contributor, which means the evidence does not belong entirely to Nancy. Someone else left biological material at that house on the night of February 1st. Investigators are now pursuing forensic genetic genealogy on that sample. If you are not familiar with that technology, here's why it matters. Forensic genetic genealogy has solved cases that sat cold for 30 and 40 years. It works by building a family tree outward from a DNA profile, identifying distant relatives through public and private databases, and narrowing inward until investigators reach a name. It does not require a prior arrest. It does not require the suspect to already be in a system. It requires only that someone, somewhere, shares enough genetic material with the person who left that DNA at the scene. That is a powerful tool, and it is being pointed directly at this case right now. Beyond the DNA, new surveillance footage has been recovered from cameras at and near the property that had not been previously reviewed. The FBI has been canvassing deeper into Nancy's world than the immediate neighborhood. Former neighbors, construction workers who had access to the area, anyone who may have had visibility into her routines during the weeks and months before February 1st. Pre-abduction dates are being mapped. The behavioral profile of the suspect is being built backward from the act itself into the preparation that preceded it. There is a dedicated, full-time task force working this case around the clock. That is not a phrase law enforcement uses loosely. That means people whose only job, every single day, is Nancy Guthrie. Sheriff Chris Nanos said it clearly this week. From day one, we had strong beliefs about what happened, and those beliefs have not diminished. That is the language of an investigator who is not guessing, who is not hoping, who has a direction and is moving in it. But here is the honest counterweight, because this channel does not give you comfort at the expense of truth. Retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent Lance Lysing told CBS News this week that an extended timeline makes it much harder to keep the investigation going, keep it current, and fight for new leads. The longer a case runs without a public breakthrough, the harder it becomes to sustain momentum. Witnesses move, memories fade. Evidence that might have been recoverable in week 1 becomes harder to isolate in week 8. The investigation is active, the clock is real, and both of those things are true at the same time. What forensic science offers is a way through that. Technology has outpaced the traditional limitations of time in a way that genuinely changes what is possible. A rootless hair, a partial DNA profile, a camera angle that seemed useless until someone looked at it again from a different direction. These are the margins this investigation may be working within, and margins in the right hands are enough.
The reward stands at over $1 million, every cent of it unclaimed. That means the person who knows something, the person who saw something in the Catalina foothills in January and did not understand what they were looking at until now, has not yet come forward. That person may be watching this right now. That person may know someone who is watching this right now. The tip line is open. 1-800-CALL-FBI. tips.fbi.gov. 520-351-4988. Over $1 million payable anonymously. You do not have to know everything. You do not have to be certain. You just have to make the call. Here is where every thread we have pulled tonight converges into one picture. A Today Show segment in October publicly placed Nancy Guthrie, a specific woman, a specific city, a specific restaurant connected to a famous name. That segment aired on NBC on November 5th, ran on YouTube, was clipped and covered locally before it even broadcast nationally. It was not obscure. It was not hidden. It was morning television at its most visible. By January 11th, 2026, at the latest, someone was already in her neighborhood, confirmed by neighbor accounts and the FBI's own footage requests. They may have returned on January 24th, and on February 1st, a masked and armed and fully prepared man appeared at her front door, knowing exactly where her camera was, knowing exactly what he was doing, and leaving behind a scene that Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos described without hesitation as an abduction against her will. The ransom notes went to newsrooms, not family. 2 deadlines passed in complete silence. No proof of life across 50 days. No arrest. No named suspect. And the FBI, 50 days in, is still moving. Deeper into the neighborhood, deeper into the DNA, deeper into a timeline that now stretches all the way back to a warm Tuesday afternoon in October when nobody in that restaurant had any reason to feel afraid. Investigators are actively exploring whether someone saw that Today Show segment and selected Nancy Guthrie as a target. That is not confirmed, but it is coherent. It is consistent with the evidence, and it is the direction the investigation is pulling toward with increasing force. The thread runs from a restaurant in October to a broadcast in November to a neighborhood in January to a front door in February, and investigators are tightening it every single day. Now let's talk about who Nancy Guthrie actually is, not the victim in a case file, not the elderly mother in a television segment, the person. Nancy Guthrie is a mother and a grandmother, and a woman who built a life in Tucson because she loved it there, genuinely and without reservation. She talked about the air. She talked about the quality of life, the way the city moved at a pace that felt human and kind. She laughed about the javelinas eating her plants like it was the funniest ongoing inconvenience in the world. She held up a glass with her daughters at her favorite restaurant and smiled the way a person smiles when they are exactly where they want to be. She had dinner with her family on a Saturday night. She was supposed to be in church the next morning. She had a front porch, favorite restaurants, routines she loved, a life so full and so present that her daughter flew home from New York to put it on television for the world to see. She deserves the truth. Her family deserves the truth. And the person who took her deserves to be found. If you know anything, a vehicle you saw more than once in the Catalina foothills in January, a face that did not belong, a conversation that felt wrong, anything that seemed off and that you have been carrying quietly since then, please make that call. 1-800-CALL-FBI. tips.fbi.gov. Over $1 million waiting for the information that breaks this open, payable anonymously. Before you go, I want to say something directly to you. If you have been here with Notebook V, watching this case, keeping Nancy's name alive, sharing these videos and leaving your thoughts in the comments at 2 in the morning because you can't stop thinking about this, thank you. That matters more than you know. The reason cases like this stay in the public conversation, the reason investigators keep getting tips, the reason families don't feel alone in their worst moments is because people like you refuse to look away.
Drop in the comments right now, do you believe this started at El Charo in October, or do you think the origin goes even further back? I read every single one, every theory, every observation, every instinct, because sometimes the person who sees the thing nobody else has seen is sitting exactly where you are right now. Subscribe if you haven't yet. We are not going anywhere. We will be here for every development, every new thread, every update, every turn this investigation takes, until Nancy comes home.